Hey everyone, welcome to today's Explainer. I'm so glad you're here, because today we're diving into a really fascinating, data-driven look at political strategy. It's wild how history just loves to repeat itself, right? We're going to unpack a recent analysis that draws a direct, almost eerie line between a massive populist campaign from the 1980s and what Pauline Hanson'S One Nation is doing right now. We'll look at the numbers, the historical parallels, and the actual strategic advice commentators are putting out there. So let's just get right into it.
Okay, let's start with the commentator's core thesis, which is perfectly summed up in this quote from the source. It's well past time Hanson must now put up or risk turning into a rerun of the Joh for Canberra push. Basically, the analysis is arguing that Hanson is at a total make-or-break moment. She has to solidify what she's actually offering voters, or her movement is just going to fizzle out, exactly like that famous political crusade from decades ago. It's a pretty stark warning, and it sets up this brilliant comparative study.
To break this all down, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at a warning from history. Second, the 1987 John campaign. Third, these striking political parallels. Fourth, the polling reality. And finally, the strategist's advice. Section 1. A warning from history. You know that old saying about those who can't remember the past being condemned to repeat it? Well, in politics, campaign behaviors, voter reactions, and especially strategic pitfalls, they just cycle over the decades. The big narrative of our source analysis is exactly that. A modern populist movement is echoing a very specific past political failure. The commentator points out the huge danger when a populist push relies heavily on stirring up massive media excitement, but, lacks the actual foundational policy detail you need to govern. Why does this matter? Because it's a classic tale of momentum versus substance. Moving on to Section 2, the 1987 Joh campaign. To really get why the commentator is warning Pauline Hanson, we need a quick history lesson. Back in 1987, Australian politics was completely upended by a movement called Joh for Canberra. This was a massive crusade led by the populist Queensland Premier at the time, Joh Bjelke-Petersen. And his goal? Absolutely wildly ambitious. He wanted to storm out of Queensland and topple Bob Hawke's sitting Labour government. The media was just absolutely hooked. Joh for Canberra was everywhere, and the ultimate dream of Joh for PM was heavily sold to voters who were just totally fed up with the political establishment. But this timeline brilliantly illustrates how fast that dream completely fell apart. The crusade launches with massive fanfare in 1987, but almost immediately, the campaign hits a wall because of a severe lack of policy detail. Rather than unifying the right, John's run just fractured the conservative vote on a national scale. It literally sucked all the political oxygen away from the Liberals, who were led by John Howard at the time, and the result? Bob Hawke's Labour government coasts to a triumphant victory. All that excitement literally just handed the win to their opponent. Section 3. Striking political parallels. When you look at them side by side, the stylistic similarities are actually kind of wild. John was this Queensland-based populist who promised a total revolution, but he offered incredibly few concrete policies and constantly dodged the tricky details. Fast forward to today, and the source argues Pauline Hanson fits that exact same mold. She's using Queensland as her stronghold, and according to the analysis, she similarly lacks any detailed explanations for how her grand plans would actually work. The source even points out that the rhetoric used back in '87 sounds identical to the talking points used by One Nation's Malcolm Roberts right now. The parallels get even stronger when we look at their big economic pitches. Both campaigns kind of sidestepped general policy detail, but then decided to anchor their entire platform on these massive, super expensive tax ideas. John famously pushed a ridiculously simplistic 25% flat tax. And today, Pauline Hanson is pitching her own giant tax idea, income splitting. Now, what's really staggering here is the sheer scale of the money involved in these modern proposals. The commentator breaks down the specific, massive financial costs attached to One Nation's promises. That income-splitting policy, it's estimated to cost the budget a whopping $6 billion a year. On top of that, her promise to halve the fuel excise would rip another $10 billion a year straight out of the budget. The source makes it very clear, slapping price tags this massive on the table without actually sweating the complex policy details is a very, very dangerous game. There's also this fascinating behavioral parallel in how they communicate. The source observes that neither leader spent much time explaining their own policies. Instead, they relied heavily on high-profile surrogates to basically translate for them. In '87, John would often just let his wife, Flo, explain to the media what he actually meant, literally while he was sitting right next to her. And today, the commentator notes that Hanson is doing the exact same thing, relying on figures like Barnaby Joyce to explain her policies and comments to the public, like the recent debates over monoculture.
Section 4. The polling reality. So we have the warning from history, and the behavioral parallels are super clear. But how is this all actually playing out with voters right now? Let's objectively look at the numbers from a recent YouGov Pulse poll cited in the analysis. The commentator points out that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is looking pretty vulnerable right now, but despite that vulnerability, One Nation's support has actually dropped by a percentage point. That leaves One Nation 3 points behind Labour and just 3 points ahead of the slowly recovering Liberals. So the crucial takeaway here is this massive irony. The source stresses that Labour is measuring as a historically unpopular governing party right now. But it doesn't even matter how low Labour's vote gets because they still win against a divided opposition. Once preferences are distributed, Labour defeats both parties. It is the exact same dynamic as 1987. A fractured conservative vote just hands the victory straight to Labour on a silver platter. And this brings us to a huge, real-world test for this whole strategy, the upcoming Victorian election, which, at the time of this analysis, is just 4 months away. Out of 88 total seats, One Nation has successfully locked in candidates for about 74 to 76 of them. It's a massive electoral test for the party, but as the source rightfully points out, just having names on a ballot is absolutely not the same thing as having actual momentum. In fact, there are some pretty severe warning signs flashing in Victoria. The analysis notes that One Nation's support there has dropped by a third. The source cites a Victorian news poll where they dipped to 90% of their previous benchmark, which is a clear loss of recent momentum. Meanwhile, the actual political contest there is sharpening right back into a traditional two-party fight between the Liberals' Jess Wilson and Labour's Ben Carroll. In this tightening race, One Nation is barely even rating a mention. The commentator warns that if Hanson fails in Victoria, it could be absolutely fatal federally. It could completely pop the balloon on her momentum.
Section 5. The Strategist's Advice.
Okay, so if the historical parallels are this dangerous and the polling is showing real cracks, what does the source actually say Hanson needs to do to avoid a 1987 repeat? Well, the political strategist's advice is incredibly blunt. They say Hanson has absolutely succeeded in getting the voters' attention, but the time for just generating excitement is completely over. To actually progress, she has to gain their trust. And according to the analysis, doing that means, well, being normal. It means pivoting to a clear, safe, and entirely predictable campaign mode. The commentator lays out 3 logical steps for this pivot. Step 1. Completely stop the political stunts. The source specifically calls out her consorting with convicted figure Tommy Robinson in London as a massive mistake. Step 2, she has to explain her plans over and over and over again until voters feel like her policies are totally clear and completely safe. And step 3, she needs to step up and personally expose the opposition's claims. She has to directly address the public on what her policies actually mean, rather than letting surrogates like Barnaby Joyce do all the talking. Basically, she needs to look and act like a real prime ministerial contender. And the commentator brings this all full circle back to the 1987 comparison. Remember how Joh had that famous catch cry whenever he got a complex question? Don't you worry about that. The source emphatically argues that Hanson absolutely cannot adopt that mindset. She must worry. She must sweat those policy details. If she doesn't do the hard work, the analysis concludes that all of this current political excitement will be for literally nothing, and it'll end in the exact same collapse we saw decades ago. So that leaves us with a truly fascinating question as we watch the political landscape unfold over the next few months. Will this populist campaign manage to actually pivot, do the hard work, and sweat the policy details to build genuine trust? Or is the ghost of the 1987 Joan campaign just destined to repeat itself, fracturing the vote and handing victory straight to the opposition? Only time and the polling data will tell. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep your eyes on the data.